Seriously, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for being here today. The answer to the question of combining intimacy with spectacle is something that I certainly don't think I achieved perfectly in anything I've done, but is always the ambition, which is to try and have a story that is small and relatable and emotional, often a love story. I love love stories. And to have that coexist with something that is insane and spectacular and maybe even otherworldly. So to me, that's always the challenge. How do you balance those things? And the answer, honestly, is partly the story structure, partly the casting, and then the magic of editorial. Because with all the planning in the world, you still find yourself in the editing room realizing how you screwed up. And so you rebalance things and you just keep doing it. And it's just the big challenge always, that combination. It was true in Star Trek for sure, it was true in Super 8. It seems to always be, it's always something that I'm wrestling with, and I keep trying to get better at it. Steven Spielberg is someone who was a hero of mine as a child, is still very much a hero. I feel like I learned from him long before I met him, and was really privileged to, and honored to work with him collaboratively on this. I don't know what the biopic would be, but I feel like getting to know him personally has simply confirmed what I believed going in, which is that he, like his films, is someone who sees the best in situations, who's ultimately an optimist, who sees the world as full of possibility, and who is incredibly entertaining as not just a storyteller, but as a human being. And so the problem is a really good biopic needs something ugly in it. Needs some kind of controversy or something. The thing about Steven is he's a really good person, and so I feel like ironically the biopic might not have the elements that he would require to agree to direct the film. You know what I'm saying? But thank you again, please. The first thought that I had was about going back in time to that period in my life when I used to make films as a kid, and that was the first idea. And I thought a movie called Super 8 about a group of 8 kids making these movies, and I thought maybe that's what it was. And before I even had that, I called Steven, who I'd gotten to know over the years, and asked if he'd want to produce a movie with me called Super 8 about kids making movies, and he luckily said yes. And it was the beginning of the process, and it became one of exploration. I knew I wanted to have the kids at the center. The idea of a child losing a parent, their primary parent, and left with one with whom there was less of a connection, that was interesting to me. The first love was interesting. The comedy of their friendships was interesting. And then the notion of combining it with a classic B-movie, monster movie, got me excited. The idea of sort of combining these genres and having it be funny and scary and ultimately emotional was a fun challenge. And that was really what I got to work on. And because the film is literally a Steven Spielberg produced film and an Amblin movie, the first film that has the Amblin logo at the top of the film instead of at the end, it completely freed me to embrace the DNA of those films that I loved as a kid, and literally make an Amblin movie that could hopefully go on the shelf proudly with other films with that association. So part of it was, you know, an homage to the movies I loved as a kid because that's what it was about. And part of it was, with working with Steven, a way to make a movie that, like you said, I hadn't seen a lot of in decades. So I was excited to go back and sort of look backwards both in life and in cinema. The big challenge was to make it feel legitimate and not like a parody. Because, and it's 1979, so it's just on the verge of the 80s. And the idea was we didn't want to use all of the, you know, crazy, you know, obvious choices. So whether it was music, hairstyle, set design, props, there were certain things that felt like it was too much like a skit, like a sort of a joke. What was amazing was how surreal it was to be on the set, because it just felt like, you know, I would pick up a magazine and I would remember reading the whole thing cover to cover, and it was like going back in time, you know, seeing everyone wearing those clothes. It was bizarre. But I wanted to do a movie that was set in the 70s for a while. I had long talks with a friend, like James Gray is a good friend of mine. We would have long talks about, like, you know, that era and those movies. And so this was on the cusp of the 80s, but it was still very much, you know, in my mind, the 70s, the end of an era, the end of their childhood, the very end of that period. It was more than anything, it was really fun to go back and revisit that time, and I was happy to have fun with it. The first part I sort of answered, but it was important. This 79 was the year because it did feel like very much the end of a particular period of time. I think the 80s has a very different connotation than the 70s, you know, in the United States. And so I feel like that to me was an important distinction. And I just love the idea that it was just, you know, as these kids were beginning to enter sort of young adulthood where the opposite sex has a different meaning, things start to get more complicated, the real adult world begins to sort of encroach upon your life. 79 felt like the right year. For me, it was just that it was the end of the analog era. That it was sort of the beginning of things, literally the very beginning of, you know, of whether it was computers or videotape, or, you know, it was sort of the end of film. You know, I love film, and it was sort of the idea that it was just when, whether it was the Walkman or the video camera, or it was just sort of a transition, and it felt like 79 and prior was sort of unencumbered by that technology, much of which I adore, but I also feel like there was a kind of purity that was, you know, that was going away. We were filming the scene in the camera store where Joe calls Alice, and we had a little rotary phone there, and I said to Joel, just call her up here, and the camera's going to be here, and we're going to be filming this direction, and we were rehearsing the scene, and I was there, I said, you know, action, and Joel picked up the phone, and he was like, and he was just staring, and I was just waiting for him to do something, and Joel said, how do I call her? And I was like, oh, you put your finger in the hole and you turn. I was like, oh. He thought maybe there's a touch screen. He didn't know. Literally, he thought there was a touch screen. It was amazing how some of the technology that was very familiar when I was a kid literally is like the monolith from 2001. Like he had no idea what to do with it. All he could do was stare at it. So,